I would like to suggest that this conference, coinciding with many other conferences across the country, which also are concerned with the city, represents the beginning of a major turning point in the history of civilization. I believe that we are witnessing the death of one cultural era and the birth of a new culture. I believe that we are standing at one of the most hopeful and truly revolutionary moments in human history. I would argue that the foundation for this tremendous transformation has been made possible by the rediscovery of man's freedom and responsibility to reform and to renew his society. And since the major social unit of modern society is the city, we are both observing and sharing in the emergence of the optimistic outlook that the city can and should be reformed and renewed. I am suggesting that we are participants in the founding of a new civilization, as different from modern civilization as modern civilization was different from medieval civilization. I suggest that the so-called modern civilization, which may be roughly dated as having lasted from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 20th century, was characterized by an outlook which denied man's freedom and responsibility to reform and renew his society, that it was dominated necessarily, therefore, by an imagination which was anti-urban. There is, I think, a vast tragic irony in the anti-city ethos which has imprisoned the minds of Europeans and Americans for the last 3 centuries, because they have been members of an essentially urban class, the middle class. We are all aware that the 2 major social classes of medieval civilization were the peasantry and the feudal aristocracy, and that both were rooted in the rural landscape. From 900 to 1600, there developed in an ever-accelerating rate a town and city population associated with the money economy of capitalism. This dynamic class was not easily reconciled with the static social model of the Middle Ages, but when this vital class rejected the social patterns of the medieval past, it trapped itself in a gigantic ideological paradox which could lead modern civilization only to utter sterility. The first successful middle-class revolution in the 17th century, that in England, justified itself in terms of primitivism, a return to natural simplicity. English revolutionary Puritanism damned medieval civilization simply for being a civilization. Medieval man, the Puritans claimed, had created an artificial entity, a civilization, from man-made institutions and traditions. It was this very act of social creativity which for the Puritans had preordained the medieval past to corruption. All of man's works were by definition profane. Only God's creation was sacred. If men became Puritans, therefore, if they rejected the profane complexity of human creation and were content to live by God's word alone, then they could exist in timeless harmony. For the Puritans, it was impossible to reform or renew any profane social structure that man had built. Salvation for men could only come through a ruthless revolution, which rejected the time-fullness of human institutions and traditions to achieve unity with the timelessness of God's creation. I would like to suggest then that middle-class Puritanism by rejecting the possibility of the reform and renewal of the institutions and traditions of civilization, was logically forced to retrogress to a pattern of primitive religion described by Professor Mircea Eliade of the University of Chicago in his books, The Sacred and the Profane and The Myth of the Eternal Return. Eliade has illuminated the burden of guilt carried by primitive man, who assumed that God's original creation was sacred in its perfection, and that human society was necessarily profane because it differed from this initial creation. The major religious ritual of primitive man, therefore, was to symbolically purge himself of his profane historical creation, to return to the prehistorical sacred creation of God. When 17th century English Puritan revolutionists justified themselves in terms of timelessness and attacked their enemies for representing time fullness, they had no choice but to deny their identity as part of a town and city culture, and were forced to invent a myth that their revolution was a return to a static, stable, rural time of origins. This is seen clearly in the views of the English levelers, who argued that England had been a Garden of Eden, populated by yeoman farmers, until the alien Normans had superimposed the profane institutions and traditions of medieval civilization upon this original perfection. By the end of the 17th century, the English rejection of civilization in favor of a state of nature found expression in the sophisticated and complex justification by John Locke of the glorious Revolution of 1689 as the conservation of a natural order against the attempt of a Stuart king to reestablish the artificial and profane complexity of feudal civilization. Locke's role in the history of middle-class ideology became still more important when his psychological theories were linked with the physics of Isaac Newton. For Locke, there was no innate complexity within the individual. Each individual was capable of living simply and purely if he was taken out of the profane, artificial complexity of civilization and placed within the wholesome and sacred environment of God's original creation of physical nature. This was the great theological significance of Newton's scientific demonstration that indeed God's physical creation was mathematically pure and simple, a perfect, timeless harmony of natural law. By 1750, the center of middle-class revolutionary activity had shifted from London to Paris. Assuming the identity of the self-evident truths of Locke's natural man with the laws of Newton's world of physical nature, the French middle-class intellectuals had begun to attack the vestiges of medieval civilization in their own country as a profane social complexity which must be purified by a return to a sacred time of origins. For the French philosophes, civilization was a dark age that had sprung from the vagaries of human imagination. The medieval outlook was not built on a rock of unchanging truth, but on the inevitably transitory traditions and institutions of history. God's true revelation was in the immutable and eternal laws of his original physical creation. It is not surprising, then, that the French intellectuals heaped honors on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who preached that all men are instinctively good, but that this innate goodness had been smothered by the corrupting institutions and traditions of a profane civilization, and that now man must somehow be freed from his social prison to return to the freedom of his sacred primitive past. And it is not surprising that a group of these French intellectuals formed the first modern school of economic thought, the physiocrats, who proclaimed that all real wealth as well as virtue came from the soil. For the most sophisticated and educated men of France, the defeat of medieval darkness by the forces of enlightenment was not to come through the flowering of an urban civilization, but through the return to a mythical state of nature populated by yeoman farmers. It was within this intellectual climate of opinion that the French philosophers discovered the existence of the British colonies in North America. When Benjamin Franklin arrived in France to explain the opposition of the American colonies to the British restrictions on colonial economic life, and to pledge his allegiance to the physiocratic principles of laissez-faire, he was accepted by the philosophes as the symbolic representative of the scientific enlightenment which must accompany the simple purity of primitive life. They accepted Franklin as the greatest physical scientist of the Western world since Newton for his experiments in electricity, and as the greatest noble savage embodying the simplicity and goodness of heart which Rousseau had demanded of his heroes. Writing of Franklin and his America, the man and the country which had escaped from the profane complexity of the institutions and traditions of civilization, to return to the sacred harmony of the state of nature of the time of origins, Frenchmen proclaimed America as the coming capital of the primitive Enlightenment. It was this vision which inspired Gaspard de Bourou to dedicate his book, Child of Nature, to the Americans. Quote, "In that land which you inhabit and which you cultivate, there are to be found neither cities, nor luxury, nor crimes, nor infirmities. Every day of your lives is serene, for the purity of your souls is communicated to the skies above you. You are free, you labor, and bring forth all about you, beside your abundant crops, a harvest of all the virtues. You are as nature would wish us all to be. I therefore dedicate to you this portrait of a man whom I have conceived as formed by nature alone." When the American Revolution began, it was clear to Frenchmen that here across the Atlantic, European men were cutting all ties with that history which connected them with the medieval past. This was no revolution merely for the political independence of the English colonies. It was a revolution against civilization. It was a revolution for the fulfillment of enlightenment. When Benjamin Franklin died in 1790, his place as the chief American representative of the Enlightenment was taken by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, too, had spent much time in France in close intellectual communication with the philosophes, and he too shared their view of America as the place where European aspirations achieved concrete expression, as the place where the ideal had become real. Jefferson accepted the view of the physiocrats, the French philosophes who specialized in economic theory, that agricultural production was the basis of national prosperity. He was committed to the idea of Rousseau, that a nation of simple farmers living in redemptive contact with the soil would naturally be virtuous. As the author of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson had justified the revolution in terms reminiscent of John Locke. Americans, Jefferson had written, were defending the laws of nature against the attempt of a medieval king to impose feudal complexity upon a pure and virtuous people. And Jefferson's confidence in the future of the new American Republic was based explicitly on the theories of the English levelers and Republicans like Harrington, who had argued that republicanism could only exist in a society dominated by yeoman farmers. For Jefferson and his fellow middle-class Americans, the most triumphant moment in history had been reached when one nation was completely purified of all man-made institutions and traditions, of all artificial civilization, when one nation had achieved organic harmony with the physical nature which was God's original creation. For Jefferson, America was a timeless, sacred, physical space, free from the profanity of all man's timeful social creations. But ironically, Americans were now cut off from their European ancestors who were still corrupted by the complex vestiges of the medieval past. So Jefferson must write of the necessary separation and future isolation of America from Europe. Here, Jefferson wrote, "Everyone may have land to labor for himself. Everyone by his prosperity is interested in the support of law and order, and such men may safely and advantageously reserve to themselves a wholesome control over their public affairs and a degree of freedom which in the hands of the canaille of the cities of Europe would be instantly perverted to the demolition and destruction of everything public and private." Jefferson had become a puritanical defender of Americans as a chosen people who had a national covenant with God which delivered them from the terror of historical time as long as they refused to be socially creative and were content to dwell in simple harmony with nature. If, in Jefferson's prophetic view, the Americans were God's chosen people living in a promised land, they had also been placed in a tragic human situation which could only become more terrible and frightening with each passing year. Defining their revolution in the English and French middle-class terms of a theological ritual of purification which would return man from the artificial and corrupting environment of profane historical society to a state of nature which was the sacred time of origins, Americans were now asked to shoulder the impossible responsibility of refusing to recreate a profane complexity of social institutions and traditions in order that they, the American saints, could remain in eternal harmony with God's immutable physical creation. For Americans, the only meaningful revolution, that from social corruption to natural purity, had now taken place in the New World, and Americans must preserve the fruits of the revolution. Any change which took place in America after 1789 must, by definition, be evil. It must be change in the direction of profane social complexity and away from sacred natural simplicity. Having achieved freedom from civilization, Americans had no further freedom. And Americans had a clear index of the monstrous spread of profane corruption in their American Eden in the census figures which were to come every decade beginning in 1790. By historical accident, the overwhelming majority of middle-class Americans in 1790 were farmers. But each year after 1790, they engaged in the building of that central location of middle-class business activity, the city. Until within a century, only half of the American population was still on the farm, and today, after another half century of urban growth, fewer than 10% of our people are farmers. Already in the 1790s, Jefferson, the great evangelist of the theological restoration of the time of origins, built upon a democratic priesthood, quote, of those who labor in the earth, who are the chosen people of God, end of quote, had become a Jeremiah warning that Hamilton's economic program would cause the growth of cities. And Jefferson warned that while, quote, the corruption of morals in the mass of cultivators is a phenomenon of which no age nor nation has furnished an example, the mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body. Jefferson's Jeremiad against the growth of the eastern cities was saved from hysteria only by his purchase of the Louisiana Territory. This huge expanse of virgin land would ensure America 1,000 years of organic harmony with physical nature before the profanity of the eastern cities could begin to spread across the nation. The final hopeful message of this high priest of the sacred time of origins was that I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they are chiefly agricultural. And this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, they will become corrupt, as in Europe. The most important intellectuals of the first decades of the 19th century seemed so secure in Jefferson's prophecy that the vacant virgin acres of the West were a spiritual land bank that would save America from the profanity of civilization for 1,000 years, that they could serve as hopeful spokesmen of this religion of primitivism and celebrate the democratic priesthood of yeoman farmers who lived in organic harmony with the sacred time of origins. Emerson expressed every tenet of this religion of the eternal return when he described Jefferson's American farmer as representative of that profession which has in all eyes its ancient charm as standing nearest to God, the first cause. All men acknowledge that uncorrupted behavior which we admire in animals and young children belongs to the man who lives in the presence of nature. Cities force growth and make men artificial. In the next generation, Whitman kept intact all the sacred phrases of the religion of nature when he wrote, "Democracy most of all affiliates with the open air, is sunny and hardy and sane only with nature. I conceive of no flourishing and heroic elements of democracy maintaining itself at all without the nature element forming a main part. To be its health element and beauty element, to really underlie the whole politics, sanity, religion, and art of the New World. Exceptional wealth, splendor, countless manufactures, even books and colleges form a sort of anti-democratic disease and monstrosity. There is a subtle something in the common earth that forms the only purifying and perennial element for individuals and society. I must confess I want to see the agricultural occupation of America permanently broadened. Its gains are the only ones on which God seems to smile." At the Columbian Exposition at Chicago, however, in 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner announced that the census of 1890 had revealed the end of the frontier of vacant land. Jefferson's spiritual land bank was exhausted in 100 years, not 1,000. It was clear to everyone that within a generation, a majority of Americans would live in the city. Symbolically, within a generation, Chicago had changed from a village to a metropolis of more than 1 million. Did this mean that Americans in the 20th century were doomed to lose their timeless, organic harmony with the sacred state of nature, and to be driven out into the timeful terror of profane historical civilization? Few Americans in 1900 were prepared, however, to surrender this loyalty to the religion of nature. Desperately, they would search for a way to redefine the faith of Jefferson and the middle-class philosopher-theologians of the 17th and 18th centuries in such a way that they could reverse this degenerate movement from the sacred to the profane. One of these latter-day prophets was the architect Louis Sullivan. Raised in the East, Sullivan described his exposure to the city in these Jeffersonian sentences. Boston City swallowed him up. The effect was immediately disastrous. The miasma of the big city poisoned a small boy sensitive to his surroundings. Against the big city, his heart swelled in impatient rebellion. Its many crooked streets, its filthy streets, lined with stupid houses, crowded together shoulder to shoulder like selfish hogs upon these trough-like lanes, suffocated him. For Sullivan, unlike Emerson and Whitman, a nation of farmers could not be preserved, but men living in towns could still dwell in harmony with sacred nature rather than profane civilization. This was not possible in the East, where too much corruption from European civilization had infiltrated. But in the Midwest, nature was still supreme, and Midwestern cities could have organic unity with nature. It was Sullivan's vision that Chicago would grow as a garden city, with its buildings rooted in the prairie and reaching toward the sky. It was his hope that Chicago would be a new kind of city, sacred rather than profane, timeless rather than timeful, because the architecture of its buildings would be organic, inspired by nature, rather than artificial, the product of human imagination. Much of Sullivan's hope, however, was crushed in the Columbian Exposition, because its architecture was controlled by Eastern architects committed to profane tradition rather than sacred nature. This victory of the Eastern aristocrats symbolized for Sullivan the loss of independence for Midwestern cities. Controlled by the traditions of the East, they too would be profane. Ironically, then, at the beginning of the 20th century, the greatest prophet of hope that man could escape the city and find refuge in nature was an Englishman, Ebenezer Howard. However, since it has been my argument that the European middle class was necessarily anti-urban because it denied the possibility of the reform and renewal of society, the appearance of a major figure like Howard is not truly ironic. Howard's hopeful message was that if man could not live as a farmer, he could at least live as a suburbanite. Howard was the prophet, not like Sullivan of the sacred city, but of the sacred suburb. And everywhere American intellectuals in 1900 rushed to celebrate the suburb as a refuge from the city. The American intellectual at the beginning of the 20th century had finally accepted the fact that most men were destined to make their livelihood from commerce and industry. But they refused to accept the fact that commerce and industry must operate in an urban environment. If commerce and industry were decentralized, they would be taken out of the man-made, the artificial, the corrupting, the profane environment of the city and placed in organic harmony with the God-given, the authentic, the uplifting, the sacred environment of nature. Most Americans in the first half of the 20th century still define freedom as the negative freedom from the responsibility to reform and renew society. Most continued to believe that the only worthwhile reform was the abandonment of social complexity in favor of natural simplicity. Such a spectrum of thinkers as our most significant philosopher and educator, John Dewey, Robert Parks, the father of urban sociology, Lewis Mumford, the major historian of American architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright, our greatest architect, and Henry Ford, our most important developer of mass production, all argued the need to destroy the city and take the people into the suburbs. And all believed that the new technology of modern transportation would enable the people to successfully flee the city and re-achieve organic unity with nature in the suburbs. Ford defined himself as a new Jeffersonian Messiah because his inexpensive cars spelled the death of the city. And for Ford, the city must die. The ultimate solution, he wrote, will be the abandonment of the city. We shall solve the city problem by leaving the city. Frank Lloyd Wright agreed with Jefferson's description of the city as a cancer on the body politic. For Wright, to look at the cross-section of any plan of a big city is to look at something like the section of a fibrous tumor. Salvation through the flight from the disharmony of the artificial society of the city to the organic harmony of physical nature even dominated the thinking of the leaders of the New Deal, who were faced with the most terrible economic crisis ever experienced by our urban industrial society. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1913 had advocated a suburban exodus, and now in the 1930s, the New Deal moved forward with a division of subsistence homesteads, which would solve the problem of urban unemployment and the spirituality of a return to nature. And the Resettlement Administration, under the leadership of Rexford Tugwell, visualized the further spiritual salvation of the nation in the form of 3,000 greenbelt suburban garden cities. Thus, the 20th century leaders of the nation, political, economic, and intellectual, had prepared the imaginative context for the tremendous flight from the city to the suburbs which took place in the decade after World War II. The great upsurge of economic prosperity which came with the war made possible the private development of the public dream of the New Deal. Here, our society's leaders had promised the problems of society would end. Here, the peaceable kingdom would be reestablished in the timeless harmony of organic unity with nature, where every suburbanite would be a symbolic yeoman farmer mowing his lawn. Inevitably, disillusionment has accompanied the actuality of the suburban frontier. The reality did not fit the ideal. It is only with the failure of the suburban frontier to provide a permanent refuge for the dream of the self-sufficient individual who can have immutable earthly harmony with physical nature that we have been witnessing the final disintegration of the antisocial, the sterile, the impotent faith of modern middle-class civilization, which can perhaps be best characterized by the motto, "Love not thy neighbor." The Puritan middle class of the 17th century did not choose to discard the bankrupt social institutions of medieval civilization. It chose instead to discard all social institutions of all civilizations. It did not choose to renew moribund traditions. It chose to reject the need for any traditions. It chose not to reform society, but to deny society. And we have lived in ideological bondage to this anarchical dream into the middle of the 20th century. We, the descendants of the European urban middle class, have lived in sterility and impotence in our social environment until this very decade. For man, I would argue, is by nature social. And if he refuses to love his neighbor, he refuses necessarily love for himself. By rejecting the possibility of social reform and renewal, the individual has built for himself a prison of such social ugliness that it truly is an environment of death and not life. If man indeed is a social animal, then I would argue his destiny is the freedom for the responsibility to create his social forms within the context of timefulness. It is this timefulness of man's social creation which guarantees the constant freedom for the responsibility to continually reform and renew the forms of his society. I hope then that we are truly a pioneering generation which has discovered that a flight to the frontier of physical nature is a flight from freedom and responsibility, a flight to impotence and frustration, and finally to a death without the promise of rebirth. I hope that we are truly a pioneering generation which has discovered that the social frontier, symbolized by the city, offers the opportunity of unending, fruitful, and creative activity. The end of the anti-urban ethos, the flowering of a faith in urban renewal, is hopefully the end of a self-denying civilization which inevitably directed most of its technological energy into weapons of destruction because it was a civilization which inevitably hated itself. Let us hope that believing in the worth of civilization, symbolized by the city, we can create a future in which man will be inspired to express himself positively rather than negatively, with joy rather than despair, with love rather than hate, with a vision of community and not alienation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. I would risk the pun that we have had a noble beginning to our symposium with this very excellent historical and philosophical backdrop for our discussion of the challenge of the city. We appreciate the lucidness of this presentation and its panoramic breadth, and I'm sure that it gives us the proper context for our continued discussion. For returning this evening to hear John W. Dykeman as he speaks about the forces which are at work in the city today. And I take this opportunity to invite all of you and your friends to hear Dr. Dykeman's lecture at 8 o'clock in this auditorium. Then tomorrow morning at 9:45, the third and final presentation in this symposium by the Honorable Arthur Naftalin, the mayor of our city, a man who, as a scholar and as a practical politician in the midst of the city's problems, will give us an address on crisis in urban government. So I invite you to take part in the events of this symposium and also to make use of the opportunities for discussion. Now, this morning, because of the limitations of time, we are going to adjourn this session in a moment, and those of you who care to may go across the hall to the lounge, and I would remind the faculty that that's the only place they're going to find their coffee this morning, and their opportunity will be given to ask Dr. Noble questions, and a discussion can be carried on. I would like to also announce that the place for the dinner this evening at 7 o'clock has been moved to the faculty lounge. It will not be here in Cy Melby Hall, but will be in the faculty lounge instead. Thank you again, Dr. Noble, for being here this morning and for this excellent beginning for our symposium. You are adjourned.